Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Papaya tea, wash processed Ecuador from Oasis Coffee Roasters. There's the bag right there. And Oasis, based out of Taipei, Taiwan. And this is their first ever appearance on this channel, as they're a coffee roaster I had zero familiarity with going into this review. We picked this coffee up from Airworks as part of their December coffee drop, as it felt like a great opportunity to add another Asian coffee roaster to our catalog for our eventual Asian coffee roaster tier list. In addition to that, this one is a La Papaya Mejorado, which was one of our most reviewed coffees of 2024. So it also felt like a great opportunity to compare and contrast this one to the other La Papaya Mejorados that we've reviewed in the past. So it'll be interesting to see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 41. And the recipe we went with for this coffee was a slightly toned down recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 93 degrees Celsius, about 199 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind roast profile for this coffee. So they do have this coffee listed at a level 2 for their spectrum. So that's to say that they do go lighter than they did with this one. Even then, by comparison with other Taiwanese based coffee roasters that we have reviewed in the past, I would say that this is probably the lightest coffee that we've had from Taiwan. That being said, when comparing it alongside the other La Papaya Mejorados that we've reviewed in the past, the only one I feel that was a bit more developed than this coffee was the one that we had reviewed from Resident. So all of that's to say that this coffee does still skew on the more developed side of things, so I feel like a lot of people would align this one with being on the more developed side of that medium light by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, first impression through the V60, and the profile of the coffee was the first takeaway that I did have, as it certainly felt a fair bit more developed than a number of the other La Papaya Mejorados we had reviewed in the past, and that did translate into the cup ever so slightly, as there is plenty of the sugary sweet aspects to it, but it was marred by a slight bit of roastiness as well. Interestingly, a lingering fruit brightness was also presented in the background, so I did have a mixed first impression. I didn't know what to expect from this coffee roaster going into it, but I did have a pretty good idea of what to expect from this coffee, given we have so much familiarity with it. Day 18, through the Chemex, and the profile does continue to hinder the coffee, as it's a notable bit better today, with a bit more of an apple-like sweetness presented in a sugary sense, just a rich, heavier, sugary aspect to it once again, with the lingering brightness presented. So once again, mixed impressions to this one, as that roastiness just continued to hinder the overall experience. Day 21 through the April brewer, and there were more mixed results, as it does feel improved in certain regards, most notably the cleanliness and the sugary sweetness, both of which were very much in line with what I had expectations for a Mejorado, but also a slightly unique feel that comes from the sugariness as it's presented. I would say the sweetness in general was presented almost exclusively from the fruit profiles, which does tend to go against what I usually experience from Mejorados, which comes a bit more in that candied-like sense, most notably that brown sugar, brown candy-like sense. Day 24, through the V60 with some lower extraction adjustments, and it really seemed to help the coffee overall with better clarity and definition, especially in terms of the peachiness, as it's the most abundant it had been up to this point. And when I did see the peachy note on this coffee, I was very excited in the hopes that it would be one of the most pronounced qualities to it. And up to this moment, I hadn't experienced too much from that coffee, but I said if this coffee is going to turn out very sweet and peach forward, it's going to be one of the more enjoyable coffees that we do review, given that it is a Mejorado coffee, but sadly, it had been hindered by that smokiness, and as of this moment, it still didn't have that peachiness, but we finally experienced that, which certainly helped, but also a strong sugariness that was coming from the apple-like aspect to it. And the best descriptor I came up for it was actually opal apples, which are for me some very sweet sugary yellow apples, and they're actually my favorite apples. So when I was experiencing a lot of those sugary sweet qualities in the fruit sense, it definitely did seem to help this one, and it kind of gave a lot of contrasting characteristic to the more roasty quality of it. Day 27 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and it's turning out mostly the same as the previous day, as there's a notable bit of peachiness in the coffee yet again, with a bit more fruit brightness, as it does continue to offer that listed apple-like aspect throughout. Otherwise, a slight bit more robust yet again, as that was fully expected going into this day. Day 30 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and every time we went back to our standard recipe, which is a slightly higher extraction recipe, then I continued to feel a lot more of development to it, as there's a fair bit of that apple-like aspect presented in both the sugariness and brightness. However, there's still that, we'll say, hindering smoky quality to it. Outside of that, a slight floral herbality and a slight bit of what I would describe as an artificial peachiness to it as well. Day 33 through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and once again the development continued to hinder the overall experience, as it does have a robustness that takes away from an otherwise bright and floral coffee, with plenty of the sweeter peach aspects coming in the finish. And then day 36 through the V60 with our lower extraction adjustments, and it just felt like this coffee naturally skewed in the direction of the more roasty aspects, as it felt like this coffee might have dropped off ever so slightly from some of the more positive earlier experiences we did have with this one. Otherwise, it was an extremely sweet experience with plenty of the sugary aspects and plenty of the listed peachiness as well. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have one level 5, so let's go through that one real quick, and that is the sweetness level 5. So for me, when it comes to these La Papaya Mejorados, they do tend to be some of these sweeter coffees out there, and this one was no exception to that, as it was presenting a lot of sweetness, but I would say in a little bit more unique of a sense, as it came almost exclusively from the fruit profiles in this coffee, most specifically that apple-like sweetness, and in addition to that, that peachiness. So that certainly seems to help this coffee overall. And I've said in the past that a lot of the Mejorado characteristics come in that more brown candy sugar sweetness, which is also presented, but we'll get to that at that moment. Let's go ahead and move on to level 4s. We'll start with the finish level 4. So I have mixed feelings on the finish, because on one hand, it could be a lot more of those sugary aspects and that peachy aspect at times, while on the other end, it does have that slightly roasty quality that hinders those lingering aspects to this one. So finish at the level 4 is fine. I just wish that it was maybe void of the undesired characteristics in this coffee. Florality, level 4. And for me, I feel like the best descriptor I had was that it had a little bit more of that red floral kind of herbal tone to it. So hibiscus is the first thing that comes to mind. I think that they just have a generic floral descriptor on this one. I could also see maybe a little bit of that honeyed aspect, given that that's something that's also associated with a lot of Mejorado coffees. But for me, it just seemed to have a little bit of that red tone to it. So that's the direction we went with the floral component on this one. Stone fruit, level 4. And on certain days, the peachiness was pretty abundant. Even then, it would have been really hard to justify it at that level 5 mark, but the level 4 was a great place to put it, as when we made that adjustment to kind of tone this one down, lower the overall extraction to it, it really did seem to help the peachiness come through a little bit more than it had earlier in the life of this coffee. So level 4 is where we opted to put that. Let's go ahead and move on to level 3s. We have quite a few level 3s. We'll start with the acidity level 3. And I feel like that might be a victim of when we brewed this coffee, because on the earlier days, it was a little bit more bright than it turned out to be by the end, as it seemed to kind of taper off in that specific aspect. So that was toned down there to that level 3 mark. Citrus fruit, level 3, and I feel like I can go a couple of different directions with the citrus fruit. So I mentioned that the apple quality was one of the more pronounced and abundant qualities, but towards the end, it also seemed to drop off to the point where it was a little bit more justified at that level 3 mark. I could also see a slightly more sugary citric fruit, something along the lines of a tangerine also being there. So a couple of ways you can look at that citric quality there at that level 3 mark. Caramel, level 3, that is the Mejorado brown candy-like characteristic, which isn't something that I discussed too much when we were going through the notes, but it was presented enough to the point where we did justify putting that there at that level 3 mark. Also a little bit of that kind of honey-like sense to it in that regard. Smokiness, level 3, that's going to be the biggest sticking point to me, and truth be told, that might be a little high for this tasting wheel, but I kind of thought about it and said, we have some coffees from time to time that do score that level 2 for the majority of them, and then by the end they're maybe not quite as smoky as this coffee turned out to be. So this one's probably closer to the higher side of level 2, lower side of level 3, probably a 2.5, somewhere in between for this coffee. But towards the end, I would say that it did seem to be a bit more pronounced, as on the earlier days it was there, and it wasn't helped when we did keep this coffee at some higher temperatures. But when we did have that, we'll say, better day towards the middle, then I could probably see that being closer to the level 2, but I decided to just leave it there at the level 3 mark to really demonstrate the way that that impacted this coffee overall. Body level 3, That's always a toss-up when it comes to Mejorado coffees, but this one had a little bit more of a medium body, a little bit more texture to it in general. And then the final thing worth discussing, the cleanliness there at the level 3 mark. And obviously that won't come as too much of a surprise given that the smokiness is as high as it is. That's definitely going to hinder the overall experience and clarity of this coffee, which is otherwise pretty well defined. As far as apple like sugary sweetness goes, it's not too common that I get something like that from a coffee. So that could have really been helpful to the overall cleanliness if it wasn't marred by that smokier quality. So outside of that, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I feel like it's pretty safe to say that as far as Taiwanese coffee roasters go, this one is my favorite coffee that I've had from any Taiwanese-based coffee roaster up to this moment. But outside of that, I think that it's no surprise that this one was one of my least favorite La Papaya Mejorados that we've reviewed as of this moment. And it's maybe a little frustrating because this coffee did have so much potential. It offered two characteristics that I absolutely love. It presented the apple-like component in a way that I've never experienced before, and one that is in line with my own preferences for apples, weirdly enough. In addition to that, it did have plenty of peachiness that at times could have been maybe a little bit more clean if it wasn't hindered by a different quality to it. So there was just so much potential in this coffee, and I feel like I wasn't necessarily able to get the best out of it, but I think that that was largely due to the profile that this coffee did offer. So we'll say that by the end, it was a pretty mixed impression of this coffee. The type of person I would suggest this coffee to. It's kind of an interesting recommendation because you do have to start with the profile. That's going to either make or break it for a lot of people, because if you're fine with this coffee being a little bit more developed, then I think that can make up for some of the other qualities that are presented in it. So the peachiness, the sugariness, the apple-like qualities, all of that sugary sweetness that's presented in here, that is really unique and a little different from some of the other La Papaya Mejorados that we have reviewed in the past. But also keep in mind that it does have that kind of contrasting characteristic to it, and it does seem to kind of drop off a little earlier than one might expect for a coffee like this. So that's interestingly the best mixture of directions I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Papaya tea, wash processed Ecuador from Oasis Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.